I was sitting on the old couch in the living room, slowly flipping through photographs that had once been filled with vivid memories. Each image on the card told its own little story, but today, I didn't feel like diving into the past. I was trying to find even a small piece of the warmth those moments had once brought, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the letter I had received a few days ago. My sister wrote that her son, James, would be spending the summer with me. It was unexpected because he usually came with his parents, but now it was just him. I remember how he used to be such a restless boy, full of questions and eager to explore the world around him. But there was something in her letter that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the tone of her words, or something in the way they were phrased that made me feel uneasy. But I couldn't understand why I had the sense that this summer would bring something unusual. The letter wouldn't leave my mind, as if it were a harbinger of changes I didn't yet know about. My gaze drifted over the photographs, and my heart seemed to try and sense what exactly in my loved ones' lives was about to change. But everything seemed as it always had, or almost always. For a moment, I set the photograph aside and pondered. Why did I feel this way? The boy I had known since childhood was coming. He was part of my world, and I should have been happy about his visit. But for some reason, doubt stirred inside me. This feeling lingered, like an indistinct shadow, barely noticeable but relentless. I glanced at the clock, and suddenly felt time slow down. There was still a whole day before James arrived, but something in the air was changing, and I couldn't help but feel it. The morning started as usual. I was standing by the stove, making breakfast, when suddenly the sound of an engine reached my ears. A car? It wasn't time yet. James was supposed to arrive the next day. But, as often happens in my life, something went wrong. I looked out the window. The sky was gray and the air felt heavy like before a storm. A few seconds later, I heard someone stop at the door. Strange. He couldn't be here this early. I rounded the corner, and when I opened the door, I saw him. But it wasn't the James I remembered. Standing in front of me was a young man, tall, with a slight careless smile and a stern gaze I couldn't quite decipher. James, my nephew, was nothing like the boy I remembered. He looked older, almost like an adult. His face still held the features I knew from childhood: sharp cheekbones, a high forehead, and a slight aura of confusion. But there was something in his eyes that made me feel like I couldn't grasp him, not like before. "Hi," he said with a slightly strained smile that I couldn't understand. I stood there, not knowing what to say. I was looking at a boy, but he was clearly different, almost a stranger. It was like I was looking at a photo of someone I once knew, yet couldn't comprehend what had happened to him over all these years. We walked into the house, and I felt how the space around us suddenly became a little more cramped. He surveyed the room as if it weren't a place he remembered, but rather a foreign space unrelated to his past. Everything felt a bit strange. I tried to smile, to say something casual, but the words didn't quite fit, like I didn't want to speak at all. "You haven't been here in a while, James," I said, still trying to catch some warmth in his voice. He nodded, but his gaze remained odd, as if he wasn't really here with me, but somewhere else, in a place where his thoughts were deeper than I could understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important. "Yeah," he replied, continuing to look at the walls, at the objects that had once been familiar to him but now seemed alien. I noticed how his gaze lingered on the old chair where Mom used to sit, and then on a photograph from our last family vacation. It was as if he was searching for something that could bring him back here, to this house, but couldn't find it. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it was just the first impression that would change over time. But something inside me kept insisting that there was something wrong with him. Several hours passed, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. James seemed to be nearby, but his presence in the house felt foreign, like an object that had accidentally ended up in a familiar place. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that he was fine, that he had simply changed, as teenagers often do. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the stronger the feeling grew that I couldn't understand this person who had once been so close to me. He continued to inspect the room as if he were reacquainting himself with it, carefully but without the usual curiosity. Sometimes his gaze lingered on the old things we had left behind when he was little: the toys, the old chair, the family photograph where we all looked young and happy. He didn't speak, didn't ask anything, just silently stared at these things, as if trying to recognize something that I couldn't see. "Would you like something to eat?" I asked, trying to bring back a sense of warmth. "Maybe a cup of tea?" He only nodded, but his reaction was so cold that I couldn't tell if it was really him. There was none of the familiar warmth in his eyes that I remembered from his childhood. All I saw was a kind of detachment, barely concealed beneath the surface. We sat down at the table, and I felt how difficult it was to breathe in the silence. He sat across from me, silently, and I tried to figure out what had changed. Sometimes I caught his gaze, focused, but it seemed like it wasn't on me. It was directed at something entirely different. His face remained calm, but his eyes revealed something more. An unexplored territory I couldn't enter. I noticed that his hands carelessly circled the cup, but the movements were mechanical. From time to time, he would look up, glancing out the window, but never meeting my eyes. It was strange because before, we could talk for hours without getting tired. We didn't need words, simply being near each other was enough. "Do you think about home often?" I asked, not knowing what else to say. I didn't even expect an answer. But suddenly, he looked up and answered in a strangely distant, almost adult manner. "Yeah, but not like before. Something's changed." And it was in those words, in that quiet certainty, that I felt something truly troubled him. It wasn't just growing up or teenage sadness. It was something more. Something I couldn't quite grasp. My heart tightened. This wasn't the James I remembered. He had become a stranger to me, and I couldn't understand what these changes were. Everything around seemed the same, but his presence made me feel like my house had become foreign territory. I tried to bring him back to the conversations we used to love, about books, movies, how his holidays went. But each question I asked seemed to echo with a cold shadow in the air, as if my words couldn't reach his world. And the more I tried to connect, the stronger I felt that I was failing. Almost without realizing it, I began retreating into the shadow of my own room, leaving him alone. The house became quiet again, and the silence grew more palpable with each passing minute. A silence that I couldn't understand. After James settled into his room, I tried to return to my usual routine. In the mornings, I always took care of household chores, cleaning, cooking, checking the bills. But today, every movement, every action seemed mechanical. Everything was happening on autopilot, and my thoughts wouldn't let me go. I stood by the window, looking out at the yard. The street was almost empty, with only a lone car passing by, leaving a dusty trail behind. The wind was light, but it didn't bring any freshness. Instead, it felt heavy and slightly ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was approaching, that this day wouldn't end like usual, that this summer would be different. I returned to the table, once again picked up the cup of tea, but neither the taste nor the warmth could calm me. My head was filled with questions, but they were vague, blurry. Why did James decide to come alone? Why this summer? I tried to understand what had changed. Wasn't this supposed to be an ordinary summer visit, like all the previous ones? He had always come with his parents, and this time everything felt so unusual. A quiet voice in my head suggested that this wasn't a coincidence, but I couldn't believe it. James had always been close to me, and the fact that he now seemed like a stranger was hard to accept. I couldn't even explain to myself when exactly this happened. Maybe it was since he became a teenager? Or maybe something had happened in his life that made him so distant. I looked out the window again and saw him. James was standing on the balcony, just like before, thoughtfully staring at the city. He looked the same as when I used to catch him in those moments, when his thoughts consumed him, and he didn't notice the world around him. But now, it felt different. He didn't seem lost in his thoughts. He was too composed, too grown up for such moments. His posture was tense, even if he tried to appear relaxed. Why was I so anxious? Why did his gaze disturb me so much? I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in that look that made me doubt my own feelings. Everything he did seemed slightly off, not quite what it should have been. This wasn't just a teenage phase. It was something deeper. I tried to force myself not to think about it, to return to my usual tasks. But the thoughts came back again and again. It was as if there were invisible lines in this house, separating us. I couldn't understand what was wrong with him. Why couldn't I bring back that moment when he was just a boy who always laughed and ran around the house without worrying about problems? Suddenly, his voice broke the silence. "I'm going for a walk, okay?" I nodded, unable to find the right words. His footsteps faded, and I was left alone in this strange silence. This day wasn't ordinary, and I didn't know what would happen next. The next day, I tried to return to my usual routine, although everything felt different from before. James was still with me, but his presence was more like a heavy silence than the light atmosphere I was used to. I decided to distract myself from troubling thoughts and take a walk in the park. Maybe the fresh air and physical activity would help me feel a little calmer. We walked along the path, and I tried to strike up a conversation, hoping to bring back even a small piece of the comfort we once had. But the words wouldn't come. I suggested talking about something light. School, friends, what he had been doing this summer before coming to stay with me. Everything felt strained. I expected him to start sharing his thoughts, but James remained silent, absorbed in his own world. "How are your friends?" I asked, hoping this simple topic would break the ice. He raised an eyebrow slightly, as if not understanding what I was talking about. "Fine," he replied, as though it was the most obvious and trivial answer he could give. I held my breath, unsure of what to say next. Here was a person I once knew as open, always ready for a conversation, but now it felt like he was behind a wall, and I couldn't find a way to break it down. Every response was short and distant, as if he weren't really here, his thoughts floating far away. We continued walking, and I tried to focus on the details. How the light played on the leaves of the trees. How the sound of our footsteps echoed along the empty path. Everything was so familiar, so comforting. But beside me was a stranger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his gloomy silence was filling the space between us. After a pause, James finally said, "I don't like these walks. Everything feels the same." I looked at him in surprise, trying to understand what he meant. He had always loved walking in the park, enjoying nature. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hear more than just the words. I don't understand why it's necessary. Everything is so—" He trailed off, as if searching for the right words, but never finished his sentence. I didn't know how to respond. He was too grown up, too closed off for me to understand what was going on in his head. Maybe it was just a teenage crisis, or maybe something deeper that I couldn't grasp. Either way, I felt that my attempts to connect were doomed to fail. We walked in silence, and I felt the gap between us growing, becoming wider with every step. At some point, I began to realize that I couldn't make him open up. Everything felt like a slow-motion movie. I was there, but I couldn't change anything. I tried to hold back the internal pain and not let James see it. Too many questions and no answers. Time passed, but we still couldn't find common ground. I was there, but he was in another world, one where I couldn't follow. We returned home, and despite the fatigue from the walk, I felt empty. On the outside, everything seemed normal, but inside me, there was a coldness that wouldn't go away. One day, when we went for another walk, I decided to show James a place that had been important to me, the old library on the corner. It was one of those places I had loved since childhood. We often came here with my parents, wandering between the shelves, picking out books, and every corner of this library was connected to memories of times when the world seemed simple and understandable. When we approached the building, I noticed his gaze drift over the ancient stone columns, the wooden doors covered with a light layer of dust. He didn't say anything, just stood silently beside me, and I felt that his attention was deeper than mere curiosity. We entered, and here the sounds of the city could no longer penetrate this quiet place. Only the rustle of pages and the faint sound of footsteps around us filled the air. When I was your age, I often came here with Mom and Dad, I said, feeling the memories stir inside me. It felt like time slowed down here, and you could be anyone. I often escaped into the world of books to forget about all the difficulties. He listened silently. There was an expression on his face I couldn't understand. He didn't ask about the books, didn't express any surprise at the old interiors. He only observed carefully. I felt that his gaze wasn't directed at me, but inward, as if he was perceiving this world in a completely different way. We walked through the corridors, and I showed him the books that had once been my favorites. We stopped at a shelf of children's books, and I felt my heart warm. I remembered how, when we were little, we used to take books from these shelves, read them together, discuss them, and laugh. But now, standing beside him, everything felt so distant. "Do you like to read?" I asked, hoping that something from these memories would resonate in him. He paused for a moment, then answered briefly, "Sometimes." But something in his response unsettled me. It wasn't the usual yes or no. There was a kind of detachment, as if he didn't want to share something important. I felt as if the old library was becoming part of the past again, not the present. This place, which had once been something we both shared, now felt like something that divided us. I suddenly realized that despite all my attempts to bring back those old times, James had become someone else. Not in the sense that he had grown up. That was clear. But in his gaze, there was a strange emptiness, something I couldn't understand and couldn't name. We continued walking through the library's halls, but I no longer felt the warmth this world used to give me. Inside, the sense grew that there was an insurmountable gap between us, one I couldn't cross. We were drifting farther apart without even trying to understand what was happening between us. A few days passed, and my attempts to connect with James became more and more desperate. I tried not to think about how he had become so foreign to me. Of course, we talked, but these conversations seemed pointless, short and mechanical, as if each of us were from a different world. He stayed silent most of the time, and I tried to fill the pauses with words that didn't make sense. But one day, while sitting with a cup of tea in the living room, James suddenly said something that made me truly stop in my tracks. "You know, sometimes I think that growing up is like becoming someone else." His voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but there was something in those words that resonated within me. He paused as if he was about to continue, and I felt that his revelation might be important, even though it was said so simply. I looked at him closely. His eyes were clouded with thoughts, and his face showed uncertainty, as if he couldn't quite understand what he was feeling. It was a moment when his usual closed-off nature cracked for an instant, and I saw before me a person who was not just a teenager, but someone far more complex than I had imagined. "You know what it's like when people tell you that you need to be someone else? When you don't even know who you are anymore and you're trying to figure out where to go?" He continued, now a little faster, as if the words were pushing themselves out. I felt a tightness in my chest. He spoke as if his words weren't just the confession of teenage anxiety, but some kind of cry for help, and I didn't know how to react. He was so focused that I didn't dare interrupt him. "You won't understand," he suddenly said, and I felt an even deeper tightening inside me. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't indifference. It was a strange kind of alienation, as if he wasn't sure I was capable of understanding what was happening in his life. He looked at me, and I saw how hard it was for him to share this. I felt a rising sense of unease within me. I had never known what a teenage crisis felt like, or what it was like to begin losing yourself. But now I understood that these weren't just empty feelings. This was a battle to be, to find yourself in a world that asks too much of you. You don't have to be anyone, James," I said quietly, trying to give him at least a small piece of the confidence I had felt when I was his age. You can be yourself. No one can force you to be someone else unless you want to be. He didn't answer right away, only remained silent, looking out the window. I understood that my words might not change everything that was happening in his life, but at that moment, I felt he had heard me. Maybe not now, but in the future, when those words would take on a new meaning for him. After that conversation, he became a little less closed off, although his silence was still very much a part of him. But in his gaze, I noticed something new, a small revelation that I couldn't explain in words. He didn't share all of his feelings with me, but at that moment, I realized that growing up isn't just a process, it's a real struggle with yourself. And in that struggle, there were no simple solutions. Several more days passed, and although James had become a little more open, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still an invisible wall between us. He shared his thoughts less and less, and I started to sense that there was something more inside him that he either couldn't or didn't want to explain. I had difficulty understanding what was bothering him. One day, I found my old journal entries, the ones I had written when I was his age. I had always believed that the struggles of adolescence stayed with us forever, but in those moments, as I began reading my thoughts again, I saw how much had changed over the years. How you grow up, but not everything you've gone through can be left behind. I looked at those entries and realized that maybe James needed to see and understand that the feelings he was experiencing were part of the journey we all go through. And perhaps my old journal would help him feel that he wasn't alone in his emotions. I decided to talk to him about it. We were sitting in my office and I opened my journal. Nervously, I began to read aloud. When I was 15, I began, and James, who had initially looked at me with confusion, fell silent at some point and started to listen. His eyes were attentive, but at the same time, they seemed distant, as if he was trying to figure out what I was trying to say. I read a few entries about how difficult those years had been for me, about how I searched for myself, how I couldn't understand what I wanted from life. In those entries, there were moments when I felt loneliness, when it was hard to find common ground with friends and family. But in these notes, I also tried to find answers. I tried to understand what it meant to be myself and how to get through difficulties without losing myself. You know, I said, closing the journal. I went through those moments too. I doubted myself too, asked myself those questions. But over time, I realized that you just have to keep moving forward, and the answers will come. Sometimes it's not that obvious, but eventually you start to understand that everything you're going through helps shape who you are. James was silent, but I saw how he stared thoughtfully out the window. His gaze was absorbed in his thoughts, and I realized that perhaps this was an important moment for him. He didn't say anything, but I felt that he was trying to understand how these words might apply to his life. Maybe in his mind, a picture was starting to form. Maybe these were those moments when you begin to feel that you're not alone in your struggles. Thanks for sharing, he said, and his voice was quiet, but I noticed how it had changed. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a moment when he started to open up, even if only for a brief moment. I knew that my words wouldn't change his life right away, but I hoped that it would be one of the steps on the path he had to walk. I had helped him, but even I, reading those old entries, realized that it was also a journey back in time for me. A journey that reminded me that growing up is not only about experience, but also about accepting yourself. When I closed the journal, James stood up, looked at me, and said, "I'll think about it." I didn't know exactly what he meant, but at that moment, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe I couldn't change his life, but perhaps I had simply allowed him to see that he wasn't alone, that we had all been like that once. Several more weeks passed, and I felt that James had become a little more open, but he still remained closed off, like a book whose pages you can turn, but you can never read to the end. I tried not to pay too much attention to it, but inside, I could feel how the growing distance between us weighed on me. At some point, I noticed that in his words and actions, there were moments that made me doubt everything. One day, as we were walking down the street again, he suddenly said, "You know, I feel a connection to this place, like I've been here before." It sounded strange, especially after everything we had gone through. I stopped to meet his gaze. His eyes were calm, but I noticed something new in them, something deep that I couldn't understand. His words took me by surprise, and I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling how each word became heavy with confusion. "I don't know. It's just, when I walk here, it feels like I know this city, like I was once a part of it. Maybe I'm thinking too much, but there's something in the air that reminds me of something. Sometimes I feel like this place has something important to tell me." I froze, trying to comprehend what he had said. His words were full of uncertainty, as if he couldn't find the right explanations himself, but at the same time, there was a depth to them that left me feeling conflicted. "You're right. This place is special," I said, a little confused. "There's a kind of power in it that makes people feel connected to it. I know what you mean." We continued walking, and I felt there was truth in his words. But was it my truth or his? I couldn't shake the feeling that James saw this city in his own way, as if he perceived it through the lens of something I couldn't understand. I remembered how he was always observing things, as if they were both new and already familiar. There was something in his perception that left me at a loss. On the way home, I thought about what he had said, about how he had managed to feel a connection to this place. Maybe he really did know more than I thought. Maybe his silence and mysterious glances weren't a sign that he was distancing himself from me, but a sign that he was trying to find something I couldn't see. I couldn't help but wonder what all of this meant. Was it just a teenage experience of someone trying to find themselves, or was it a sign of something greater? But no matter what was going on in his mind, I felt that his words were important. Maybe they were the key to understanding what connected me to this city and to this person. I couldn't say exactly what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I was beginning to feel more and more that this city, which we both knew so well, was becoming something more than just a backdrop for our time together. It had become something alive, something that resonated in our hearts, even if we couldn't fully understand how. The summer season came to an end, and despite all the changes that had happened over these months, I felt that James and I were slowly approaching the end of this unusual and strange time. We hardly spoke about his departure, and I even started to think that maybe I had imagined everything, that this summer hadn't been as special as I had felt. But something inside me whispered that it would leave an indelible mark. The last evening before he was to leave, we decided to take our usual evening walk through the streets of the city. The same path, the same evening light from the street lamps, but everything was different. I felt how these last minutes seemed to stretch, almost slowing down, and every step echoed in my heart. We walked in silence, without the need for words. I understood that it was unlikely that I could express all the feelings that had built up over this summer. James and I hadn't talked about our emotions, hadn't shared confessions. Even now, as the farewell loomed in the air, we couldn't find the right words. Everything had been said in glances and silences. The sky gradually darkened and the street lamps grew brighter. We walked along the sidewalk, past old buildings, past shops that seemed to never change. But I knew that so much had changed for us. James had become someone else, and so had I. There was something bittersweet in this, but at the same time, it was freeing. We stood at the edge of the crosswalk, and I felt how this moment was becoming something important, like a goodbye that we couldn't bring ourselves to say out loud. "Will you miss me?" I finally asked, the words slipping out as if I couldn't hold them in anymore. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw again that strange mix, uncertainty and, at the same time, awareness. He slowed his pace slightly, and I noticed how his gaze softened. He didn't say anything in response, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew that for both of us, this moment wasn't just a goodbye. It was a farewell to what we had been, to the time we had spent together, and to the unspoken words that we hadn't managed to say. Eventually, we reached my door. I stopped, and he slowed down too. The night was full and quiet, and I felt as if everything around us had frozen, waiting. James looked at me, as if saying goodbye with his gaze, but once again he didn't say anything. And I too couldn't find the right words. I couldn't say the usual goodbye. Instead, we simply stood there in silence. He turned and left, and I knew that this was a farewell we both understood but couldn't express. All that remained was the silence and the strange feeling that something important had gone with him. When I closed the door and returned to the quiet of my home, I felt how this summer, despite all its oddities, had left its mark. This moment, his silence, our unspoken closeness became a part of me, a part of what I would carry within myself. And despite the fact that we hadn't said all the words to each other, I understood that this summer had changed us both. It had gone, leaving something important behind. Something inexpressible, but still lingering.